Okay, so hello and welcome to the first lecture of the course of Architectonics from the Mind, Architectures and its Cognition. Today we're going to talk about the idea of composition. So as a starting point, we're gonna start with this picture, which it is a photo of something which is rather canonical among many architectural masterpieces as buildings. And even if you have not seen this building before or trained in looking at a building in an analytic fashion, please take a moment to look at that one, as if you were looking at a painting, for example, or a sculpture, or any other work of art that presents different entities put together to form something else. So if you like, you can mark a pause in the video and skim through this image and take your time. This is a famous building from an architect called Le Corbusier, built during the second half of the 20th century, not far from here in France, Longchamp. Far from here, meaning not far from the Swiss border. And while you're looking at it, you can ask yourself, why this building looks like one object? Even though you clearly see individual elements composing it. Each element tells you something about what they are and why they are put together. For example, you see a pillar holding a part of a roof. You see that the wall that is facing you is punctuated by windows and entrances, probably to give way to light inside the building. There is also a staircase along that wall that give way to entrances from openings in that wall, which are marked by doors. And while you are scanning through the building, you could consider also those elements as characters or events of a story that progressively unfolds in front of your eyes. Some words come to mind and reticulate towards other meaning than only the description of what these elements are, of what this building is. For example, you might look at that column supporting that wall and you might think, oh, it reminds me of a chimney, or at a pizza oven, oh, it reminds me I would like to order pizza tonight, and so on and so on. So the meaning that arises from looking at that picture is not entirely held by the building itself, but way beyond that. And this unfolding of signification, this journey among elements and what they form together, is what happens when an architect intends to model an object. By articulating parts together, this is a creative act of transformation that shares similarities to others, as in painting as well, for example. Yet the significant difference in architecture is that it is dealing with definite elements or parts, in comparison to more indefinite and abstract components, such as color in painting, for example. So this is one of the fundamental operations in architecture, what defines it at its core, and it's called architectonics. This is also what we're going to talk about today. And here is a question that haunts architectural discourses about representation, structure, signification, is that if architecture aims to produce signification by articulating parts together, where is such signification emerging from and how? If you're curious, you can skim through the history of ideas and discourses in architecture by looking at certain keywords such as proportions, harmony, rhythm, symbolism, syntax, vocabulary. And you will quickly see that this problem of articulation and signification is really at the core of all of them. So today we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about architectonics, of course, and we're going to talk also about composition and compositionality as a way to articulate two different bodies of knowledge, one in architecture and one in cognitive science. We can approach the previous question on whether the richness and polysemy of the world we dive in is not generated from our individual minds, our collective minds, or something out there in the world, or everything all at once. We can ponder that question. And what the advances in science and the understanding about the world and the mind gave us is deeper ways to understand the way we deal with that world, the way we understand intelligence as well, and the way we model it. Sometimes architectural questions are too myopic and redundant in comparison to larger concerns in humanities and science. And sometimes it is the opposite. That's why it is critical to cultivate a good balance by checking oneself where else such question has been asked and how it was asked. Eventually, asking a good question is what makes a good research as well. So to help us do that, we can use this schema as a guidance. This is the schema I use myself in my own research, my own question, and that I would like to share with you. And you can read this one as a single closed loop, or you can say also a circular progression of thinking, even though it's more like a Mobius kind of shape than a circle. You can read it that way and start from a thing in the world to an object in the mind to an object in the world. These are very abstract words, yet we hear them all the time without questioning them. Things, world, objects, mind. And they hold very, very powerful definitions in the way, in the role they play in articulating meaning. So let's start, for example, with thing, the first point, which is, one can say it's something that, a thing is something that does not have a description. It is actually a funny thought experiment, because as soon as you try, you can't stop having some words or description attached to it, as if your mind would do it anyway without your consent. One cannot stop intending to make sense of whatever comes to your senses. And a thing is in itself a description, because without it we could not communicate or share this understanding. It is probably the closest we can get to a minimal description in our way of thinking. So in the world we have things that don't have a description yet, that come to mind. And the world in itself, you can think of it as an outside to you, or you can think of it also as something you are part of, or your body included. You can also think of it as a universe in which you are the sole hero, an ego-centered world, let's say. You can think of it as a physical world where certain things are commonly shared. For example, if we were all running through the same wall, we would all hit it the hard way. A notorious joke from the 20th century French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who worked on these ideas from his own perspective as well about the real, said that reality is what hits you in the face the hard way. You may also think that the world is a sort of container made of indefinite things and definite objects with descriptions. depending on the way you look at it and the way you think about it. And objects, in contrast to a thing, is an object would be something that one can describe. Right? There's a description attached to it, and this is what helps to hold sense and meaning to what you have in mind. And the mind then is what is actually putting some glue between descriptions and things to form objects that cohere and help us to understand the world and how to navigate through it. Understanding what a wall is to you and your environment might help in avoiding hitting it, right? So a description of what it is attached to this wall that you're perceiving outside in the world is helping you in navigating in that world. And so this schema encompasses a myriad of discourses and ideas about the environment at large, whether it's a built environment or not, and the way we, as intelligent entities, are dealing with it. Also the way we are trying to model intelligence. So this was a very abstract beginning. But now the question is, where do we start? At which point do we take to start talking about such abstract yet fundamental idea? We need to grab a point in time and space to relate a bit more to that. So how to articulate events in a continuum that would produce significance, coherence, collective memory? It's something that we can see also throughout the work of someone called Herodotus in a book called The Histories. And it turns out that it is a founding work in Western history. It's an important link between the Greeks, the Persians, and ancient Egypt, in a way that it was an effort to preserve past events due to war and other conflicts, where power plays were also directing the course of collective memory through archiving and narrating events. It is a well-known link between Eastern culture, known to the Greeks as the ancient world, and the foundations of Western antiquity. How to deal with the world, of course, is a fundamental idea in every civilization, but the way this question was asked was completely different here and projects myriads of ways to think about it. If you're curious about that, you can ask your professors of history and theory to dig deeper on that particular aspect. We will deal here only with a fragment and of that concern, one facet of it. But as it turns out, this particular point on how to articulate events to form a history that is foundational to Western culture is also a point of departure for architectonics. And so architectonics, what is that? It is actually a term that emerges from Greek antiquity, at least from that point that we mentioned, and which initial vectors were coming from the rock stars of that period, which were Plato and Aristotle, which constituted architectural theories from the Renaissance onwards later on. A very interesting article from Lisa Landrum, for which I leave here a QR code that you can grab. Who wrote about the formative definition of architecture at that period, where indivisible elements were to be articulated wisely and which one should call now parts in our story, were mostly organized around two terms, which were the arche and the architecton. The latter was a prototypical figure of the architect led to cultivate such articulations for greater ends for the city. And regarding the Renaissance, one of the most famous references about architectonics and the Renaissance is, of course, Alberti at that time. Also because he was a strong advocate of the architect as an author, an individual designer, if you prefer. Before him, architecture was understood as a deeper temporal act of transformation where a building would be constructed over several generations. And so several architects and design revisions, eventually producing a physical object expressing by layers such temporality. And that later position laid out strong emphasis on the architect's design intent or party or vision of the world in their design. So here you see a famous picture of what is called the definitor, the finitorium, an instrument that was designed by Alberti and published in his treatise De Statua in the manner of a pantograph. And so the finitorium was designed to capture the finitio, or the individual definition of the specificities of a represented object. And this instrument allowed to transform points of a model in an alphanumerical data for the delineation of the city of Rome in the 15th century, for example. Another general reference you can also use to start digging in the ideas of architectonics is a book from John Hendricks, wrote in early 2000 about Platonic architectonics, and there you can see the references from between Greek antiquity and Renaissance being laid out. So I showed you first a building articulated from parts, and now I am showing you a part articulating other parts. Architectonics present in many ways. It can be present in many ways to articulate and organize life also in the city. And I could show you some examples through buildings again, but it would not necessarily express the power of that idea, how it deals with heterogeneity, plurality, uncertainty as well, as in what defines a city as an aggregate of things. And with this act of articulation, then you can see also the way architectonics was defined to become poles of magnitudes in order to provide orientation and circulation within the architectonic domain that was the organization of the polis, the Greek city. The practical use of punctual stones called horoi. Here you see a reproduction of one, which obviously didn't have such marking on it originally, but was reproduced for modern tourism in the city of Athens. So the practical use of the stones were used to mark identities, places, general locations, thresholds, without property lines in the Greek territory. And they were one of the few extant artifacts of such relation to boundaries through polarities, establishing magnitudes and negotiation of different entities coexisting together. So after briefly explaining the foundational idea of architectonics, this foundational term, and what it means regarding articulation for modeling in architecture. Let's jump now to the term of composition, which is deeply linked to the way to produce, to express this articulation. So very briefly, according to the 17th century art critic Roger de Pile, for which here I'm showing you the book called The Principles of Painting, published at the early 18th century. The idea of composition was an invention of painting first, and much later came to architecture. We will get through that. While composition was forming a set of canonical rules about painting, other subsequent ideas such as modulation appeared later on to be a better means to deal with irregularities, multiplicities, uncertainties. Ultimately, the goal being seen as an attempt to transcend and escape composition, and an endless task of the mind and the body in painting to achieve that. A great example of that evolution of thought is in the work of the post-impressionist painter of the 19th century, Paul Cézanne, for example. Through his work, one could oppose the ideas of modeling with modulation, but that is a story for another lecture. In architecture, composition was most probably derived from the idea of distribution in the 18th century. Distribution of the rooms, the organization of the inside, as it was understood by then. Distribution started to become directly affiliated with this kind of organization. The neoclassicists Jacques-François Blondel and Marc-Antoine Laugier as well, in an essay on architecture, revisiting ideas of the Renaissance, were denoting this term also in trying to, especially for Laugier, to revisit ideas of the Renaissance. Here is a famous drawing from his work where what was called the primitive hut, you see a little hut in the background, which is composed of tree trunks and branches. This served as describing basic articulations of primitive parts without denaturing them. And the term of distribution endured some transformation first before landing as composition, and reunited with the pictorial term of composition at the Beaux-Arts Academy of Paris in the end of the 19th century with the architect Julien Gadet in his publication of Elements of Theory of Architecture. And it is still an aspect of modeling that actually went through contemporary approaches after the digital. Progressively, a form of pre-structuration, of pre-specificity to architectural modeling was taking place in the evolution of this term. And in a critical period of the architectural idea of composition, Jean-Louis Nicolas Durand and another contemporary, Quatremer de Quincy, emphasized the modern approach on what was called the architecture as language thesis. So Jean-Nicolas Durand is an important neoclassicist architect for the first half of the 19th century, important for his efforts in systemizing architectural modeling. He is seen as a forefigure of digital architecture in that sense. And Quatremer de Quincy was his contemporary in building a conceptual framework for the structure of architecture. The two of them were essentially following the same vector. Here you see a screenshot of some of the efforts of Durand in systemizing the design of buildings. And while Durand developed a sort of grammar for instructional and infrastructural purposes. He was essentially teaching and educating polytechnicians in France to design the infrastructure of the country. Quatremer de Quincy did so to formalize ideological representations. So progressively, grammatical building blocks of the classical orders became directly and metaphorically associated with semantic instances. And later on, it seemed to be also tacitly understood as a necessary trade-off between articulating parts together with desired variants of the times and the efficient formalization of pre-specific structures. By doing so, evading from the question on how to generate anything without the grasp of pre-specificity at all, or let's call it now a syntactical structure. Eventually, the syntactical legacy pervaded throughout the late 20th century by establishing grammatical frameworks, for example, with someone called Christopher Alexander, who wrote a very important book called Pattern Language for Architecture, or William Mitchell, who wrote The Logic of Architecture. Even further, architects like George Steiny and James Gibbs, who wrote and developed a work around what is called shape grammars. And we'll get to that in little details later on. But the problem was, by the end of the 20th century, it became evident that architecture was incapable to stabilize sufficient language-like features. There were just too much polysemy, uncertainty, and fleetingness of signification at work to be fully handled that way. And this lands in an interesting point to correlate with cognitive science, because as a crisis of meaning in architecture, relates to a cognitive turn elsewhere. But before that, let's point out also to other stories that try to evade from pre-specificity in modeling, and which are also linked to painting. With the generally growing concern for uncertainty in compositions came also the English development of the picturesque. From an Anglo-Saxon perspective, composition played a significant role in the development of the picturesque. The modern reappraisals of antique Greek architecture, such as the Greek Acropolis, for example, was also considered as a form of picturesque that further developed in the idea of the architectural promenade and the notion of temporal agency and procession in modeling. So back to the picturesque then and its formation, the seminal work of Edmund Burke in differentiating beautiful and sublime along an axis of more sensible experience in the 18th century greatly participated in the idea of an architectural experience as a dynamic model. Burke is a philosopher of the European Enlightenment in the 18th century. And in the English vision of aesthetics at these times, as well as free planning of English gardens, there was a promotion of discovery, of multiplicity of moving points. It was important in the appreciation of an architecture to do so. It was especially recognized and developed in the design of English gardens that way, the idea of the picturesque in moving the point of experience of an individual across a scene would bring the power and the means to appreciate an infinity of dispositions in the garden. And similarly, the marking of limits of such garden as a whole would disappear in English designs in order to experience variated thresholds, and the idea of a guiding horizon would serve as a replacement for navigation. garden designs became perceptual dispositions that way, and their values, whereas appreciation were left to individual cognitive and dynamic appreciations. Another alternative story of evading composition, which is linked to the same phylum of the picturesque, the same reconsideration of modern thinking, Greek antiquity throughout the idea of experience, is with the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, another figure in architecture that brought in modern composition, temporal dynamics, and this tentative escape to structuring axes and centralities through the idea of organicity. And this is the idea of organicity is very strong in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright in the design of his buildings. He's an American architect of the 19th century. And his work is often associated with the tentative to build a form of generative grammar again, but with an organic base that does not grow, that does not evolve from a pre-structured system, but meaning that the different parts refer organically to each other to form a whole aggregatively. As they are not organized around a center, around an axis, but they organize each other all together. One of his most famous buildings, of course, the Falling Water House in 1939, is an exemplar building expressing that idea. And if you wish to look at the constellations of ideas of composition in architecture, I recommend you this book from the late Jacques Lucan, who draws out this extensive work and research on those theories and those efforts throughout 2 centuries about composition. So this is a QR code which will lead you to the ETH library link for the English version, otherwise the original version is in French. So this book. But now, as we have seen originally with architectonics, architectural modeling is concerned with parts to articulate. And so we have here only half of the schema. As we start from parts, objects in the mind, to become a whole or a building as an object in the world, we leave out the way we sense things or things come to mind to form such objects. So what about that second half? Does architecture needs to be concerned by that? Doesn't it seem that the pre-specificity of parts as an input is leaving out a significant aspect of the story in the articulation of meaning? It seems so. So here is what I think and what I propose as a position for this course. If composition can be seen as a work of the intellect, then producing meaningful articulations from a scene, a visual scene to simplify, is a feature of the mind. And some consequences of developing the reflection further fall back within the vocabulary of architectural modeling and needs to be challenged. Digging deeper into relationships among parts and their aggregations leads to an important field of research called mereology. We will not dive into that, as it is not primordial for the point we're trying to make here. But let's consider that if there is a precedent to a part, it probably follows certain mereological logics, as it would be made of smaller components. And as we are disaggregating the binary basic structure of architectonic components, parts and whole, we open up for a broader range of articulations. Then parts become instances or tokens, which are holding certain amounts of features that would come to mind to form those objects. And wholes then open to become scenes as a stage where we would sense those features that would come to mind. I would like now to introduce the parallel we are trying to implement with cognitive science here. Manfredo Tafuri, who is an important theoretician and critic of architecture in the 20th century, said that linguistics permeated architectural discourses from the 60s onwards in an attempt to solve the problem of architectural meaning through analytic and structuralist methods, heavily based on the linguistic analogy. So architecture as a language thesis. In comparison, the cognitive turn is an important moment in science, which happened a decade before in the 50s and shaped cognitive science in order to gather different disciplines such as like AI, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, under one big umbrella to study human cognition. So I won't trace the same history as I did for architecture, but I will explain what I think is a very important aspect and corollary to architectural concerns nowadays regarding the production of meaning. We can call it now two key figures in the foundations of contemporary, what is called computational representational theories of the mind. One is Noam Chomsky, an American philosopher and linguist of the 20th century, known for his seminal work on generative grammars, which deeply influenced the previously mentioned work on shape grammars. Here you have one of the foundational books that he published in 1957 called Syntactic Structures. And on the other side, you have Jerry Fodor, who is also an American philosopher, mainly involved in the philosophy of the mind, and known for developing the thesis of a language of thought a bit later in 1975. Was a publication of this book. And while Chomsky was arguing for an innate universal grammar structuring the mind, explaining how complex linguistic meaning emerges from simpler components, Fodor was opposing an overarching system led by thought itself prior to language. Mental representations are structured and allow for a systematic combination of simple, basic mental symbols into more complex thoughts, then leading to language. A compositional structure in the mind, if you prefer. In short, the fight was around the question, what is structuring what, language or thought? So, the stakes in that fight were to find an adequate location for the idea of the generative, for the generative model of the mind. Where is the generativity placed? In language or in thought? What comes first? And this moment leads to other important aspects of the study of human cognition, such as the opposition of connectionism with symbolism, in short, whether or not mental processes arise from distributed processing in connectionism, or modular ones made of symbol manipulations in symbolism. It also has important ramifications in theories of perception, in memory, in computer vision, and of course artificial intelligence as it deals with computations and representations on how compositionality leads to form objects in the mind and attach descriptions to them from small and segmented perceived features such as edges, textures, shadings, and so on. So if there is already at this point in the perceptual cognitive processes of the mind a place where signification is shaped, what is the role of pre-specific compositions in architectural modeling then? Is it really important? This is one of the questions I explored when I was doing my PhD here at ETH. And so I will briefly talk about it to close this presentation as one possible way to confront architectonics with computation and human cognition. So the research was called neurodesign, modeling with neural potentials, and it was involving the use of brain-computer interfaces. So very briefly, trying to make a digital bridge between a computer and the human brain. And by doing so, establishing communication pathways to establish a sort of fluent conversation between two different kinds of intelligence. And here the task was to try to develop new modeling methods for architecture by establishing this sort of communication. And so the task was to aggregate parts from the flow of thoughts and reducing the need from pre-specificity in such design to the minimum. So here you see some examples of one demonstrator, which was later exhibited in the museum at the end of my research, which is essentially the progressive formation of two vertical aggregates through the use of a brain-computer interface and the development of machine learning algorithm to be trained with the thought of aggregating those parts in a particular way and being able to generate them again in a fully automatic way. And before aggregating before aggregating all those parts together, there were prior experiments with the same BCI technology to generate a lot of random parts that share certain features together and would not give away evident configurations, obvious configurations on how they would come together. And so here is a final set of these parts used for the aggregative process. And then, in order to start the aggregation of those parts in an interactive fashion, we had to start to first learn from basic physics and geometry, from very, very minimal structures, which are here represented in those aggregates, which are essentially piles, masses of parts put together, not colliding with each other, laying on the ground, but not expressing anything else than the idea of not collision, and implicitly also their position, their relation in space with each other regarding their implicit geometry. And so the way to do that, the way to pre-train a model to have this basic knowledge was to do some early work with the first available transformer models by then, which are now known as large language models, and to transform this sort of aggregates into extremely basic and minimal semantic structures to learn from. Oops, sorry. And essentially, eventually, with this work, I produced aggregates which tried to contain features which were not related to the initial dataset, but more to architectonic vectors such as verticality or sequences linked to mental representations of a column. So the task, while building this interface, while looking at different configuration of those parts over and over, while training this learning model, was to focus on the idea of the concept of a column. And what emerged was the progressive vertical, the selection progressively of vertical aggregates that would more and more tend towards being vertical, but also start to reveal certain idea of sequences and turns, which were absolutely not specified and were proper to the selection process, without any words or other physical actions being done. By simply looking at it and decoding neural signals related to early decision-making, such as visual discrimination. So once you can establish such interface, you can train this generator, learn these features, and reproduce them in a range of variants that a pre-specific system might not necessarily have been able to contain. So two columns were produced in a way to show that. On the left, you have the column which emerged from an entire training process. And the right one is its fully automatic generation from the trained model without any human interaction. So this is the way I personally engaged with the idea of architectonics and digital technologies, the way information and communication technology also may establish pathways to capacities of the human mind, which were hardly accessible and even harder to interact with. Yet, powerful features of the mind we may So finally here you see also, let's say, a capture of one of the training sessions, of one of the generated configurations which were used to train such generator. While looking at it with a brain-computer interface in order to to get the signals. So this is a very, very brief explanation on how this technology was implemented and used. You can of course access the thesis. It's at the ETH library, in much more detail in both its theoretical and technical aspects. Or you can also ask me more about it in course if you like, with pleasure. Nevertheless, this is the way I personally engaged with the idea of architectonics and digital technology, with the way information and communication technology may establish pathways to capacities of the human mind, which were hardly accessible and even harder to interact with. Yet there are very powerful features of the mind we may now engage with to challenge and question architecture. So I hope there will be plenty more of those different approaches and questions rising in the following years. And with that, I say you until next course. Thank you.